I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series each semester. We have 10 to 12 lectures each semester that focus on a theme, and this year we're taking advantage of the 100-year anniversary of when the U.S. entered World War I, and we're going to have lectures all about that topic from our faculty and authors and other visitors. All through the end of November. And today's speaker is Dr. Adam Paddock. Adam Paddock is an assistant professor at UW-Whitewater, where he teaches courses in African history and 20th century world history. He received his master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin in 2012. He is a recipient of a FLAS fellowship from the University of Florida and a two-time recipient of the Lumumba Research Fellowship for African History, which he used to travel to Nigeria several times to complete his dissertation research. Adam's research focuses on the southern areas of Nigeria from the late 1800s up to the 1970s, with a focus on children's history. He co-authored one book titled The Women's War of 1929, A History of Anti-Colonial Resistance in Eastern Nigeria, and he has co-edited two books and written several articles. His current research is on Boy Scouts in Nigeria and child socialization up to the 1970s. Please welcome Dr. Adam Paddock.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carrie, for inviting me to be a speaker in the lecture series, and thank all of you for coming today. Just so you know, I have my phone up here to make sure that I don't go over time. But I promise you, unlike my students, I will not be texting during the lecture today. Okay, so the title of my lecture today is No One Wants to Go to War, and it's about African participation in World War I. It's a topic that is often overlooked and isn't often presented in discussions or documentaries on World War I. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first give you a little overview and context, and then we'll talk about some specific things. And so the order of my talk, I'm going to first give you a little bit of origin, just briefly background information on colonial armies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between French and British usage of colonial soldiers in World War I. I'm going to discuss the East Africa campaign of World War I between largely the British and the Germans, which isn't heard about so much. And then I'll finish up with just some overview of what World War I meant to Africans and their participation. By the way, the subtitle, or the title No One Wants to Go to War, comes from oral history of those African soldiers from Senegal that participated in the war, okay? And I'll come back to that again in a little bit. One thing that I want to note about World War I and why I think that this topic is so important is usually when you see things about World War I, almost all of the participants, whether they're films about World War I or documentaries, are generally white Europeans or white Americans. And I think that's part of what we call nationalist history. That when countries sort of think back, right, on the types of conflicts they're involved in, they often frame it in a way that reflects the average citizen, right? Especially movies, right, like Hollywood movies. They want it to relate to the most possible number of audience, right, that they're going to gain. And I think that that has led to misrepresenting the conflict, not only leaving Africa, the conflicts there out of the story, but actually leaving many of the colonial soldiers who participated in the war in Europe sort of out of the story. And what I have up here is meant to kind of reflect that. Often when you see the casualties, for example, of World War I, they're listed by country. And really that is misrepresentative because really, as I've listed here, really what they're doing is noting the flag of service. So all of the casualties, right, for the top two, the British and the French, they're not actually all British and French citizens, but they represent the soldiers that fought under that flag, okay? And to just give you an example of what I mean, the British in particular drew soldiers from all over their colonies, from Canada, Australia, and then also other places, New Zealand, South Africa, so on and so forth. And so this is what partly is missed. And as I'll explain, many of these colonial soldiers were actually the front line of defense. It was often the colonial soldiers that the British and the French used as the first line of attack. If you remember World War I, right, and the trench warfare, soldiers charging right into the defensive positions, okay? And so that's just to give you a little backdrop. And I think for Africa, what is really important to recognize is that when European countries were expanding their colonies in Asia and Africa, they didn't actually use mostly French or British citizens in their army. If you've ever read lots of British literature like Sherlock Holmes or other things, you may gain from that that both the British and the French might have officers from their army, but largely the rank and file of the colonial army came from the colonized locations. For example, even in Indochina, the French in the late 1800s were actually using mercenaries from Spain and the Philippines to help them conquer what is modern-day Vietnam. Okay? That's really important for the story of colonial conquest, which obviously isn't the emphasis here today. But the connection here is I want to argue that actually when Europeans use colonial subjects, and I do mean to note colonial subjects, not citizens, okay, because they're subjects of the British and French Empire, not citizens. That's important. But what I want to convey is that during World War I, the British and French were actually continuing a long practiced method of engaging in warfare that started in the late 1800s and continued into the 20th century, which was to utilize the subjects of the empire as largely a rank and file for their army. Okay? And in World War I, this is widely used in Europe. Depending on what scholar you look at, some people have estimated upwards of 8 million colonial subjects were used by the British just in World War I. Okay? A large number is coming from Australia and Canada. Now, some of those people were volunteers, but the overwhelming majority of all these soldiers, whether from Canada or Africa, were actually conscripted. They were forced into military service, right, as the British or the French considered that as a part of their duty to the empire, right, to participate. So that's sort of the larger context. And here is an image. This is as early as the 1880s and 1890s, and this is a German image depicting soldiers in the German colonial army. And so I'm going to focus on the French, the British, and the Germans, since they're the three main groups during World War I that fight throughout the war. But of course, Germany also is a part of the story. The French actually, if you're familiar with the Crimean War, the French were using Senegalese, West African troops as early as the Crimean War, okay, long before World War I. The other thing to keep in mind is that at the time of World War I, it was a time of deep-seated racist ideology in Europe and the US, for that matter. And what was popular at the time, right, in early 20th century was the idea of scientific racism and eugenics. And this partly informs the practices of these European countries in their relationship with African troops and the World War I experience. The British and the French didn't use the same kind of policies, okay, with their soldiers during World War I. And I want to highlight this difference. On the left here, there's a picture of a book, actually, on the British colonial empire. And this is about the West African troops that participated in World War I for the British. The British, and really the French too to an extent, when they ruled their colonies, they inherently at this time believed that they were superior to Africans. Racial superiority, right along with eugenics, was a very strongly supported idea. And so what that meant was for the British, they didn't believe Africans could ever be their equals. And so a part of their strategy with controlling their colony is they wanted their colonial subjects to believe they were inferior to other British citizens. That's really important because the British initially did not want to use their African or Asian soldiers to fight in World War I. They believed that if they taught Africans or Indian soldiers from India, it was okay, right, to combat white people. They were afraid then that that would lead to more resistance in their colonies. And so initially, the British strategy was to use their West African soldiers within Africa or Asia, but not to use them in Europe, okay? And often, if they did use them in Europe, the British strategy was to use them as labor, right? Labor to rebuild roads that are destroyed or bridges, or to use them in digging the trenches and those kinds of things. If you're familiar with World War I, you probably know that there was a major offensive by the British planned in Gallipoli, okay? And that actually, out of desperation, was the first time the British used Indian soldiers in Europe in that conflict. I haven't had a chance to watch it, but if any of you have access to BBC, I do know there was a pretty good documentary series on the colonial armies in Europe during World War I. I've not watched it yet, but I've heard it's quite good, so I'd encourage people, if you're interested further, maybe that's something to take a look at. The French, however, had a different strategy, perhaps partly out of necessity. I already mentioned that the French used soldiers in the Crimean War, and so they had a long-standing, right, strategy of using colonial soldiers. And so the French had no problem conscripting and using soldiers from West Africa in the European campaign. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But this gentleman here, his picture, his name is Blaise Diagne, and he was originally from Senegal. And the French were different than the British in the sense that they allowed a very small number, literally about 40,000 French black Africans, okay, to have some rights of French citizenship. Okay? And Blaise Diagne was one of those. He's a very famous person. He's the first person of African descent to hold a position in the French government. And when World War I broke out, the French encouraged Blaise Diagne to support recruitment efforts in West Africa, and he did so. And as we'll see at the end, that led to his complete demise as a politician. He lost all credibility from Senegal because he supported the French recruitment initially. This is a really loud map. I'm sorry for the confusion on the map, but it basically shows two things. The arrows show that from Senegal, French took its West African troops to Europe. Whereas the British, whether they were from West African troops or South African troops, they used them either in East Africa or in Asia primarily, okay, rather than taking them to Europe. The West African troops that served in the French army were called the Senegalese tirailleurs, and they were essentially not just from Senegal, okay? They were actually from a huge area. If I go back, if you can kind of probably maybe even back further. Do I have a good map at the beginning? I think, maybe. This huge area of French West Africa. So large numbers were from Senegal, but they were drawn from all over what was called French West Africa at the time, which is really a massive area, actually. And the Senegalese tirailleurs most of them were forced into the French colonial army. And the French used several tactics in order to get them into the army. And most of this forced conscription began in 1915. Initially, the French, like many Europeans, thought World War I was going to end quickly. There were about 21 regiments, or battalions, I should say, about 21 battalions of soldiers from the Senegalese tirailleurs that fought in the early part of World War I in Europe. But once they realized the war was going to drag on, the French wanted to conscript far larger numbers of West African soldiers to help them in the European theater of the war, which led to 93 new battalions being formed. Out of those 93 battalions, 42 fought in Europe. So in order to form those battalions, the French used a variety of tactics. Initially, they tried to get them to volunteer. They were slow to do so. Usually the only people who willingly volunteered were those forced into poverty. A little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but poverty in Africa was largely a creation of the colonial empires, okay, for a whole number of reasons. If you have questions about that, maybe at the end I can briefly try to answer. So some, maybe out of necessity and desperation, would join, but generally most of them were conscripted, and a variety of tactics were used to conscript approximately 250,000 soldiers from this area of West Africa. First, they tried a head tax where each village or city was required to supply a certain percentage of young men to participate in the war. But people resisted that. They would flee and try to evade and avoid being conscripted into the army. They did lotteries that would randomly select individuals that were required to serve. But they also forced people by the point of a gun. They would kidnap people and do other things as well as they became more and more desperate to fill the ranks of their colonial army. And one thing that is common, both for World War I and World War II, the French and the British both, generally when dealing with Africans, they didn't know their age. It wasn't important to Africans to count exact age or to have birth certificates like Western culture. And so oftentimes whether an African was deemed ready to fight was based on their height. Okay, right? So if somebody, a young man, right, was tall at 14, it would not be uncommon for him to have fought in World War I or World War II. In fact, if anybody's familiar with East African history, the famous dictator Idi Amin Dada from Uganda served in the British Army during World War II as a young man of 13 or 14 years old because he was very large for his age. Now, I'll get back later. I'll explain a little bit more, as you may even guess, some of the significance of that kind of experience. Now, I think one important thing to note about these Senegalese tirailleurs is that the French actually used them for what they called shock troopers. In other words, the Senegalese soldiers tended to be the first ones to attack defensive positions. And this is several books written on this. There's a great book on the oral history of these soldiers, if you are really interested in this kind of topic, where a scholar interviewed, before they passed away, many of the soldiers that fought from Senegal in World War I. And in fact, not only did many of them serve as the first wave of attack, but they also distinguished themselves with merit. Many of these soldiers were awarded by the French with the Legion of Honor and other awards. I was actually, before this lecture, trying to find the number of medals awarded to them, but it's not so easy to find the information. But I was hoping to have that for you, and I apologize I'm not able to find that. But generally, even if you look at French newspapers and other sources, these soldiers were highly regarded, even though they're often lauded for keeping up their morale, even when as much as 66 to 67% of their units were killed in many of the major battles in Europe. In fact, these soldiers served in all the major European conflicts, Chemin des Marnes, Flanders, Ypres, Verdun. All those battles included large numbers of these Senegalese soldiers. I have some other photos of them as well here that you might find interesting. I like this one because it shows them, some of them proud of the medals that they earned, and they're displaying them. As I mentioned, in addition to actual fighting in the war as soldiers on the front lines in Europe, many were used as labor, either as porters or other means of labor, as I mentioned, like digging trenches, building roads or bridges, those types of things. And in fact, as we'll find at the end, perhaps the most deadly work an African could do during World War I was actually being a porter, carrying supplies and those kinds of things. And I'll give you some statistics on that in a bit. This is German East Africa, okay, an old photo of some soldiers digging trenches. And this is hard to see, so don't worry so much. Don't strain your eyes, please. But basically, I'm going to talk a bit about the East African campaign, which took place in this huge area of East Africa. So mostly just look at the arrows. Don't worry about trying to read everything on the map. And in German East Africa, essentially what happened was the German Navy during World War I in the Pacific Ocean was defeated relatively quickly. And they were largely defeated by the Japanese. The Japanese at that time had a very industrialized military, and they had actually been beating Europeans in wars for some time. And it is largely the Japanese Navy that defeated the Germans, right? They were allies with the British and French, although the Russians and others participated as well. And what that meant was that, you know, the Germans didn't have access to Europe through the Suez Canal. The British and the French controlled the Mediterranean Sea. And so what that did was it cut the German colonies off from Europe. And so the Germans actually didn't really use, as far as I know, didn't really use any colonial soldiers in World War I. But they did have large numbers of German soldiers in West Africa, okay? Or excuse me, in East Africa. And the British, with their South African army, as long as from West Africa, sent soldiers and units to East Africa to fight the Germans. And the German commander, Peter von Lettow-Vorbeck, had trouble holding the colony of Tanzania, which was a German possession at that time. And one of the problems he had was not only with that he had limited resources there, but the fact he couldn't get resupplied because the British and the French generally controlled the seas by this time. And so as he was under siege and facing a siege by British soldiers, Lettow-Vorbeck decided to flee his base, right, the fort in Tanzania, and literally started running across East Africa, trying to avoid the British and some French soldiers. And essentially for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, throughout East Africa, southern and east and central Africa, the British and the French, some Congolese troops as well from Belgium, chased Lettow-Vorbeck, okay? And this is probably where we have the most significant consequences of World War I on the African continent itself. Basically what happened as these soldiers were fleeing, whether it was the German army running from the British or the British trying to chase them down, the soldiers needed supplies along the way, which meant they generally stole whatever they could from Africans in East Africa. They would take their livestock, their crops, all kinds of things as they were trying to get food and resources to stay alive, and they would force Africans, of course, to carry their weapons, right? They would have to pull or transport ammunition, weapons of all kinds, and so on and so forth. And this is where I say that probably African porters paid the largest price for World War I involvement. For the British alone, 90,000, at least 90,000 African porters died in this year-and-a-half period. Is they either were worked to death or starved because much of the food and things that they were requisitioning from locals went to the regular army and not to the porters. And often the porters were forced to carry these loads but were not supplied. They were expected to sort of care for themselves. At least half of these porters came from what was the British colony of Kenya at the time. It's estimated that 13% of Kenya's male population died as porters working for the British during this engagement. However, the consequences for Africans working and fighting for the Germans was even far more severe. It's estimated that at least 350,000 East Africans died working for the Germans as they were trying to flee the British Army. Some scholars estimate it that in East Africa, 1 out of every 7 males died in this time period as a result of this conflict. But that's not all. Owing to the confiscation of crops and livestock, at least 300,000 other African civilians starved to death during World War I, directly as a result of these events. And the consequences for East Africa and also of West Africa extend far beyond this in terms of casualties. Many of you probably know that right on the eve of World War I finishing, the flu pandemic raged across Europe and America. But what people don't often realize is that was also very prevalent in Africa as well. And in places where people were suffering from low nutrition already, it meant that the flu pandemic had even a more disastrous effect than other places. People have no idea how many Africans died directly as a result of the flu pandemic and the ending of World War I, but it's not, it's conservative to say probably 2 million or so, okay, in East Africa alone. Here is I have some photos of some of the African soldiers that fought in the German army in their colony of Tanzania. And one thing I want to point out is that it is often overlooked as somebody might ask, well, why use African soldiers anyway? In addition to bodies, of course, right, to perhaps throw at the defenses of the enemy, what a lot of people don't realize is that in both, especially in West Africa, Africans had been using guns for hundreds of years. Guns were the #1 import in Africa beginning in 1600 with the slave trade. So actually there were many very skilled African marksmen and markswomen, which is a sort of a separate but interesting story. The Kingdom of Benin at the time had women who were sharpshooters as early as 1850. So first of all, one thing to recognize is that these African soldiers were not unaware and unfamiliar with the use of firearms. They had been using them for hundreds of years. They had their own blacksmiths, even with modified guns. They understood them very well. But also, in terms of labor, these African soldiers were also skilled railroad and road builders. The reason is because all the infrastructure built in Africa that the colonial governments wanted to use for railroads to extract resources or for roads to move their colonial army were all built by Africans through forced labor. The colonial government believed that because Africans were inferior, they believed that they needed to teach them how to be good citizens and subjects of the empire, so it was their duty to supply their labor at no compensation. And so, in fact, when they're drawing in World War I, okay, for these soldiers, they're actually, in these men, they're not actually unfamiliar with these things. They're actually very skilled workers and soldiers. Here's another of the German soldiers. And this brings me to sort of conclude some of these ideas. One thing that's very interesting about this story is that you would think the Europeans would have, based on their experience of colonial expansion, would have realized World War I was going to be more of a disaster than it was. Perhaps the reason that they didn't realize it is because they'd used so many colonial soldiers to fight the colonial wars, so that they didn't really bear the cost of some of those casualties. But many of the strategies used to fight World War I were already experimented with in their conquest of colonial expansion, a decade and 2 decades even before World War I. Some of you may be aware or not that it was actually the British in South Africa during what we call the South African War in 1902. They were the first country to actually use concentration camps in order to try and defeat the Afrikaners in South Africa. And I think, so the one thing I'm trying to point out here is that the legacy of World War I is closely connected to the colonial legacy. That we see lots of similarities in continued tactics. Some of the same things used in colonial wars were later implemented during World War I. But for Africans, World War I had some severe consequences. Early on, people like Blaise Diagne that I've mentioned, they didn't think, Africans never believed they're actually inferior to Europeans. But some people like Blaise Diagne believed that, you know what, maybe there's some advancements and ideas in Western societies and that the Europeans have that could be useful to us. And they said, okay, we don't really like colonial rule, but let us try to take what we can use from this experience. And so Blaise Diagne sort of supported to an extent, not completely, but to an extent, right, thought this colonial situation could benefit them in some ways. World War I, in many ways, destroyed that way of thinking. For the British, right, I said that they wanted their African subjects to think in sort of this idea, right, that the British were superior, right, to justify ruling them. And a part of the language was this idea of the civilizing mission, right? Europeans at the time argued that, well, we're colonizing them, well, it's bad that we have to kill them to take them over. Eventually, we're going to bring them the benefits of civilization. Generally, that never really happened. And what World War I does, and even World War II more later, was it makes Africans stop and say, hold on, wait a second. These Europeans are saying they're more civilized than us. But what about World War I is civilized? What about World War II is civilized? And so for the average African that gets pulled into these conflicts, they begin to understand and experience racism differently than maybe they did in the earlier colonial period. And that's part of the reason why I used the photo on the left. These African soldiers in Europe, what they saw was they saw how Europeans actually lived. They saw what modern society really meant, and they said, wait a second. The Europeans have not brought any of this stuff to us in the colonies. They've not brought us factories and better jobs. They have us working fields to bring them the raw materials for their factories in Europe. And so what World War I does is it initiates in Africa a new wave, and that wave will grow in 1935, but initially a resurgence of resistance to colonialism as a result of their experiences. Not only their experiences on the battlefield and the horrors of World War I, but also just with their experiences with racism on a more regular and daily basis. In addition to that, I think it's also important to consider, and I think that this is really what I want to gain, if I can achieve something with this talk, is to sort of counter, right, Hollywood and popular films and depictions of World War I, and recognize the extent to which even the trenches in Europe were not a white European experience. That it was, World War I was indeed a world war, and it wasn't just a world war because battles were fought in many places around the world. But the very experience on the fronts in Europe were this collection of people from literally all over the world fighting in those trenches. And let me stop there, I guess, and if that's okay. I think I'm about on time, so I guess we open up for questions now. Carrie, is that? I believe that was my last. Yeah, that was my last photo.
What questions do folks have? You can raise your hand and I'll come around. We're still thinking about taking it all in? Sure.
Could you tell us about your handsome costume?
Sure. My wife is a Nigerian national, and basically what this clothing is that in a country like Nigeria, where my wife is from, you go to a market, you buy a bolt of cloth of whatever style that you like, and then you have a tailor make it for the entire family. And so basically my wife and kids have matching styles. So if you have a special event to go to, you would have these made to go. This one was just one. I don't know why my wife had this one made, but I have some that have importance to me. You know, I have one for our marriage. I have, our children in their culture have naming ceremonies, so I would have one at home that was for that event for my son and my daughter, that kind of thing. So, yeah, exactly. I think there's a question over here.
I always stand on the wrong side.
I wanted to wear a different one that I like more, but it's getting cold. One has to be careful.
How did this involvement of the Senegalese and the other Native American, or not Native American, but the troops affect their citizenship?
Okay, in terms of West Africans, for example, almost none ever had citizenship. And this is an important thing about empire, right? Africans, whether they were Senegalese or British, the overwhelming majority, you're talking 99.5%, 99.5% of French, West Africans under French rule were never offered citizenship. And this is an important thing to note, is that we think of countries like France and Britain as being democracies, and they were at this time. But the way that they governed their colonies was not democratic. The way that they governed their colonies was autocratic, okay, like dictatorships, because those people did not vote. They did not have representation. The numbers of those Senegalese, like I said, for a place that had maybe a population of 10 million in that part of Africa or more, you had about 40,000 that were considered French citizens. So that is really not much influence. So it's always very limited. And that is important to the story, I think, right, and to this history of colonization. I'm not going to make everybody cry. If you were in my college class, sorry. Maybe you would as we talk about the details. But what I tell my students is that whenever a group of people consider another group of people as inferior, anything and everything did happen. So I won't gross you out with all the terrible details, but yeah, that's unfortunately a part of this history, is they were saw as inferior, they weren't seen as citizens, and that led to all kinds of bad things happening, much worse than participating in World War I even. Okay.
Did the troops have any effect, the black troops, whether they had any effect on the eventual attack to colonization? I know that a lot of it was, Africa was cut up after the war, but did these people who fought and died, did they become politicized in any way, or?
Oh yeah, especially families, definitely. I mean, this is what I'm getting at with this idea of another wave of anti-colonial resistances. Absolutely. And one thing that's misunderstood is sometimes people think that Africans accepted colonial rule, and that was never true. From the moment that they ended up losing, and sometimes, quite frankly, places like the Ashanti in modern-day Ghana fought the British for over 80 years. Groups in South Africa like the Xhosa fought the British for 100 years. And so, contrary to public perception sometimes, those wars of conquest were never quick or easy for Europeans. After the war, because Germany surrendered, they lost all their colonies in Africa, and the British and the French divided them up between each other. And even during World War I, in Nigeria, for example, in eastern Nigeria, a group called the Yeku-Meku actually started resistance war against the British during World War I. Because they thought, oh wait, the British have had to move all their troops to German Cameroon, now it's time to resist again. And I think that's an interesting and important part of the story is that Africans never accepted this colonial rule, that they would change their tactics based on what the circumstance allowed. Okay, so it's a good question. Yeah.
Did any of these troops stay in Europe after the war? Or were they all sent back?
Good question. Most are sent back. I won't say that none stayed, but I'm not completely sure. I might guess that some might have stayed, but most were sent back. Most of those who were interviewed actually, when oral historians were collecting their accounts, it was in Senegal and other places in West Africa that they collected the stories. I know a bit more about that for World War II, but I guess that's beyond the scope. But as far as I know, most went back. They would have been decommissioned, so to speak. But what is also interesting is actually, yes, now the more that I think about it, I think yes, I think most did go back. I think those stay pretty rare. And one of the reasons is that in a lot of places in Africa, the colonial governments were still actually trying to control the borders they claimed. And in fact, the colonial army after World War I, for both the French and the British, actually became bigger than it was during World War I, as they were trying to clamp down. Because Africans tend to want to resist more now, it meant that now the British and the French had to use more force, right, to make sure that they controlled those colonies. Good question.
I think your microphone might have turned off.
Did it?
No, it's not you, I'm sure. So I'll get your question, then I'll have you answer in this microphone here.
Sorry about that.
No, it's not you.
I noticed from the original map that Egypt was considered independent. And my question is, did they involve themselves as independent Egyptians, say in the Middle East, or were they used as colonists of Britain?
To be honest, I don't recall. Whoops.
The original map.
Okay, all the way back. Sorry, I didn't go to the first one. All the way back. Okay. It says independent British occupation. Okay, I think this map is a little bit confusing then in that way. I wouldn't say Egypt was independent, okay? Egypt is a confusing story because it started out as a joint British and French possession, and then the French dropped out when they wanted to take Algeria, and the British controlled it. So I'm not sure, to be honest, why they put independent British occupation there. To be honest, I don't recall troops from Egypt. They may have participated in some point, but actually I'm not sure that I know much about that, to be honest. I'm sorry.
Other question? Oh, sure. Can you just ask the question and we'll have you repeat the question?
After the war, the Africans that fought, was there any benefits after the war was over, or was it back to life as it was before?
That's a good question. So he's asking, were there any benefits to Africans after the war? I'm assuming you mean, because they participated or something like that. No, absolutely not. And the same thing will happen in World War II. Many Africans will sacrifice, right, as a part of that and won't gain benefits afterwards. For World War I, that's a part of that resistance. If you think about it, right, any rational person, if I'm fighting and dying for a cause, shouldn't I get some rights or something in return, right? Reciprocal for this. And no, they were colonial subjects. Okay, they weren't citizens, so they did not. And that is a part of why the resistance to colonial rule will sort of continue and develop. Because that's exactly what the Africans wanted. All right, they never wanted this colonial rule. And this will be one of the great arguments, right, the Africans will make both after World War I and World War II, this argument that the Europeans are the ones that are uncivilized. Right? They're the ones that are pulling us into these terrible conflicts, right? And quite frankly, at the end of World War I, things got much worse for Africans because what happened is the Europeans realized that they could make a lot of money off raw materials from Africa, okay? And what happened is at the end of World War I, Africans were being forced to work for Europeans and they were getting paid less than they would have before the beginning of World War I. The Europeans made more money, the compensations Africans received for that work went down. It didn't go up together like you think it would, it's just a tragic story. Many of the things that the Europeans forced Africans to produce were things you couldn't eat or didn't want to eat. Chocolate, like in Ghana, cocoa, peanuts, right, for your peanut butter and peanut oil, cotton for clothing. And much of the land in Africa was turned over to what we call monoculture, a single crop, rather than a diverse set of food sources. So if I say that colonialism contributed to poverty in Africa, directly so in that regard. And so things got much worse, actually, after World War I for the average African. Absolutely. In the back.
You mentioned the Japanese got involved. What benefit were they seeking? Or why would they become involved in that?
Yeah, okay. Well, fortunately, I teach enough modern world history. I happen to know the answer to that, but it is a little bit outside my expertise. But the Japanese, after the U.S. landed there in 1856 or 57, the Japanese, in the late 1800s, initiated an industrialization, modernization effort to avoid conquest because they saw many other places in Asia, like India, Indochina, Southeast Asia, fall to European colonization. And the Japanese were very successful with their modernization efforts. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were defeating Germans, they were defeating the Russians in military conflict. And what the Japanese hoped to get, and what they got, was more territory in Asia. At the end of World War I, at the Versailles Treaty, the Japanese said, basically said, well, what do we get out of having participated in the war? And essentially, the French and the British said, well, what do you want? And Japan said, a nice big piece of China would be nice, and they gave it to them. And that's actually, oddly enough, is the origin for the communist movement in China, actually, and a retaliation to being upset over Japanese occupation in what was the Shandong Peninsula, okay, what we call the May 4th movement, if anybody has heard of these things, began at the end of World War I in the early 1920s. So, yeah. Any other questions I can answer?